I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumber here again for JoBlo.com with another video edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the 1994 Martin Campbell film No Escape, starring Ray Liotta, Lance Henriksen, Stuart Wilson, Kevin Dillon, and Ernie Hudson, with an awesome score by Graham Mervell. Now, this one takes place in a dystopian future where a soldier named Robbins, played by Ray Liotta, murders his commanding officer and is sent to a nightmarish penal colony called Absalom, an island ruled by cannibals. They are led by the charismatic and sadistic Merrick. Escaping his captors, he falls in with a society of non-violent ex-prisoners led by the father, played by Lance Henriksen, who preaches redemption. But for Robbins, the only thing that matters is escape. Now, I'd say that No Escape is an obscure but very important film. It's particularly important because it was the movie that landed Martin Campbell Goldeneye, and that's the movie which reignited the James Bond franchise after it almost petered out in the late 80s, and Campbell managed to do it again for Daniel Craig in 2006's Casino Royale. Whenever they need to launch a new Bond, it seems like Martin Campbell's their go-to guy. It might be a bit of a stretch, but in some ways, if it wasn't for No Escape, the Bond series may not have made it outside of the 90s. Of course, this isn't an article about James Bond, but rather about a film that's so obscure, the Weinstein Company poached the title for their own Wilson star of the same name, a film which coincidentally co-starred Pierce Brosnan. It's so obscure that it's not even out on Blu-ray, and you can't get it digitally. The only print of the movie available is an obscure DVD that's out of print from HBO that's non-anamorphic and a pretty piss-poor transfer to boot. Nevertheless, it's come out in some other regions outside of North America. Now, this one had quite the pedigree. It's produced by Gail Ann Hurd post-Terminator 2, and it was one of the few movies put out by a studio named Savoy Pictures. This company was briefly prominent in the mid-90s, but most of the movies were pretty disastrous. In fact, I'd say the only Savoy Pictures film that people really remember is A Bronx Tale, directed by and starring Robert De Niro. They initially made quite a bit of noise in the business because they tried to launch as a major studio, to the tune that they paid Sylvester Stallone a whopping $20 million to star in a film that ultimately never got made, and they changed the idea of what superstars should be paid, leading to tons of $20 million paydays in the late 90s, something which backfired badly when their movies didn't perform, such as what happened to Sylvester Stallone for a period after Assassins and Judge Dredd and The Specialist all came out and didn't do the business that people were expecting. So Savoy's lineup was notoriously poor. Even though they could afford to pay Sylvester Stallone $20 million, the rest of their movies, I don't know who was picking these films and thought they were a good idea, but it boggles the mind. I mean, one of the big movies that they did was called Exit to Eden, which is an erotic thriller set in an island resort that's into B&D and S&M and B&S. And for some reason, it's directed by Gary Marshall. You know, Gary Marshall from Pretty Woman and everybody's favorite grandfather in a bunch of movies. And it stars Rosie O'Donnell and Dan Aykroyd in an erotic thriller. I mean, Dana Delaney looks pretty hot in it, but that's about it. Exit Eden was a notorious flop, so bad that on the Rosie O'Donnell show, Rosie O'Donnell used to make fun of it constantly, even doing an impression of Gary Marshall admitting, "Rosie, we did a bad job, it's not a good movie." And then they did another movie called Destiny Turns on the Radio, which I think was an attempt to launch Quentin Tarantino as a leading man. It didn't really work. So No Escape, which boasted a $20 million budget, not bad for the 90s, was their attempt to break into genre, and somehow they managed to land Ray Liotta, who was actually at a career high around this point, coming off of Goodfellas and Unlawful Entry. And he got the lead, which gave him a chance to finally shed the bad guy image he was famous for. They actually managed to open this film at #1 for the weekend, but No Escape sadly wasn't able to sustain any kind of box office momentum, and in the end only eked out about $15 million in the box office. Probably not a disastrous amount because I think it probably did okay overseas, although foreign numbers really haven't been released, and I'm assuming that it probably broke even on video and cable. I know it aired on cable a lot. Now, No Escape was a bit of a cult video in the mid-90s thanks to the futuristic premise and the hardcore action quotient. As a 12-year-old, I remember being blown away by how unapologetically brutal it was, and I have to say, at 38, I think it still holds up as a pretty solid actioner, albeit one that's kinda cheesy in certain respects. For one thing, No Escape is another one of those movies that totally screwed up their pessimistic vision of the future, imagining 2022 as some kind of hellish, post-apocalyptic future where prisoners are sent to remote islands to be hunted by cannibals. Also, I have to say, the VFX in the early scenes, which are set in a futuristic prison, don't really hold up, paling next to a much cheaper, similarly themed action film of the era called Fortress with Christophe Lambert that I actually wrote a column about some months back. However, once they leave the futuristic prison and go to the island prison, the movie becomes something of a variation on Most Dangerous Game, where Ray Liotta has to survive on the island, and boy oh boy does No Escape pick up big time, thanks mostly to some well-staged action and a top-notch cast. Even back then, Martin Campbell had a flair for carnage, and the numerous chase scenes and fights are good enough that one could really see why Eon snapped him up for Goldeneye. It helps that Liotta makes for a credible anti-hero, with his intensity giving the character an unpredictable streak, and the decision to only reveal his motivations for killing his commanding officer later in the film is a good one, because for much of it, we really don't know if we're supposed to be rooting for him or not. A daring move in an action flick. For the first hour of the movie, kind of part of me as a kid thought he was actually the bad guy, and that somehow one of the other prisoners, maybe Ernie Hudson or Lance Henriksen, was going to emerge as the hero of the film. Liotta seems like he's kind of out of control and violent. Of course, it does emerge that he's a hero later on in the film, and I think that Ray Liotta plays this duplicity pretty well. Too bad then that his career as an action lead didn't really take off. It seems that people still prefer him as a scumbag for some reason. He's got this edge to him, I guess, that doesn't make for a heroic type character very well, but I think he actually is really well cast, even if he's totally cast against type. The supporting cast is also really good, with Lance Henriksen ideal as the peace-loving father, quote unquote, while Ernie Hudson is his tough but loyal second in command. Ernie Hudson was all over action movies like this in the mid-90s, and I love him. He was the coolest guy ever. The real scene stealer here, though, is Stuart Wilson. Now, Stuart Wilson was just coming off of Lethal Weapon 3, where he was the villain. I'm gonna eat your fucking heart! He was pretty good in Lethal Weapon 3, but he's absolutely on fire here in such an atypical role for a middle-aged English guy. I mean, he plays this guy named Merrick, the head of a cannibal tribe who's got these dreadlocks, and we also sense would rather Ray Liotta just join his gang and be his pal, as he's the only one to actually show any smarts. Seems that that's what he wants. He just wants a friend.
Listen, you gotta go, sweetheart. I'm not gonna stand in your way. I could probably use the
I'll
exercise.
stay.
And that makes him kind of sympathetic, even though he's doing crazy things like decapitating people. He's funny, he's unpredictable, and had No Escape been more widely seen, I think Wilson would have totally been established as a premier baddie, although Campbell himself probably understood that Wilson was great and reused him to pretty strong effect a couple of years later in The Mask of Zorro. The score by Graham Revell also deserves praise, with it one of his first big assignments, and helped establish him as one of the go-to genre composers of the late 90s and early 2000s. It's a really, really strong score right from the get-go, and I really like the whole No Escape theme that they play. That kind of, it's a motif that comes back and forth in the movie. Now, there are a lot of really good scenes. One of the things that really makes the movie work is the weird gallows humor that they have. And this is a great scene. So Ray Liotta gets dropped on the island and is immediately picked up by Wilson's gang, who are assuming he's going to be a pushover like all the other prisoners that they sent to him, and they try to make him take on a hulking member of their tribe in hand-to-hand combat. Now, the idea is that this guy is just going to dominate him and destroy him, and he's going to be meat that they can eat. Liotta is a genius in this scene. So the guy is about twice Ray Liotta's size. It looks like he could crush Ray Liotta like an ant, and Ray Liotta was never really a hulking action star. He looked like a normal guy. But what's cool about his character in the film is that he's smart. So they give him this little piece of wood, a spike, to fight this guy with the hammer, and rather than take him on in hand-to-hand combat, he just uses it as a spear and impales him, and boom, he's dead. The way that he deals with this threat and just completely knocks the guy out of the fight, and Wilson's reaction is a priceless action moment and one of the best scenes Campbell ever directed. I mean, I kind of think that this is the scene which got him Goldeneye. Now, if you want to see No Escape, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. No Escape's home video rights have always been tied up in a strange position. They used to belong to HBO, that's right, the TV service HBO, who seemingly lost interest in all the theatrical movies in their catalog because in the 80s, HBO actually used to produce films. It was a way of helping guarantee that they had enough product to air on their TV stations. Now, these weren't made for cable movies, these were actually full-on films. There were movies like Flashpoint and a couple others that came out that were produced by HBO, including Ricochet starring Denzel Washington, another movie that I did for Best Movie You Never Saw. And unfortunately, as these movies kind of languished and became more obscure, HBO seemingly lost any interest in using them. The Hitcher was a similar thing, although I believe that The Hitcher has been picked up by a distributor. Unfortunately, No Escape hasn't been picked up by anybody yet. The only one of their movies that actually did get picked up was A Bronx Tale, which has gotten a good release. So the only way you can kind of find this movie is in a bare bones DVD release from the late 90s, which is not anamorphic, and I believe is out of print, although you could probably still find some cheap copies of it on Amazon. However, it's really not a good transfer at all. So if you want to see this movie, I kind of recommend looking places for it because it's not that hard to find. It's, how you might say, available? So my parting shot is that No Escape is probably the most obscure movie I've written up for this column just because it's so damn hard to find. The tricky rights issues make it difficult to track down, but at least if you want to see a well-presented version of this film. If you don't mind looking at a crappy version of this film, I think you could still get the Snapper Case DVD pretty cheaply. That said, the effort that it takes to track down No Escape, from my point of view, is well worth it, especially if you're a hardcore action movie junkie for that era. It's really a cool 90s action flick, and one that I think a lot of people haven't seen. It'd be really cool if a company like Shout Factory, especially through Scream Factory, was to give this one a good HD upgrade. So, try to find it if you can. I really think it's a great movie, and well, I love this one, and it really is the best movie you've never seen. For JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, Chris Bumbray here again with another best movie you, well, let's say probably never saw. The Replacement Killers, starring Chow Yun-Fat in his first American big screen vehicle, and a movie that I actually had the poster of on the door of my bedroom all throughout my teenage years. And in this one, Chow Yun-Fat plays a Chinese triad assassin who has to grapple with his conscience when his boss orders him to kill the young son of a tenacious police officer played by the one and only Michael Rooker. Unable to go through with the assignment, he finds himself in the crosshairs of the LA underworld with a tough forger played by Mira Sorvino as his only ally. Now, in addition to Chow Yun-Fat, Mira Sorvino, and Michael Rooker, the bad guys in this movie are played by Danny Trejo, Till Schweiger, and Kenneth Zhang, and it has music by Harry Gregson Williams in one of his earliest scores, and it's directed in his feature film debut by Antoine Fuqua. Now, times have really changed. When The Replacement Killers was made, Antoine Fuqua, who was making his feature debut after several well-received music videos, which included the now famous Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio, was apparently struggling with Sony over the final edit for the film, with things between them getting really tense. 19 years later, Antoine Fuqua is one of their biggest directors, having made The Equalizer and The Equalizer 2 and The Magnificent Seven reboot for them, and recently signing an overall deal with the studio, guaranteeing that his association with them is long-term. But it wasn't always this way. When The Replacement Killers was made, Fuqua's ambitions for the film were limited by the studio's desire for a quickie B-movie actioner. But even in its compromised form, with a theatrical cut only running 87 minutes, it stands as one of Chow Yun-Fat's better American movies. Fuqua had Hong Kong cinema down cold and knew how to present his iconic star, although the gun fu style action was still pretty new to audiences in 1998. with Chow Yun-Fat's old director John Woo having only recently caught on with his face-off only a few months earlier. Now, Chow Yun-Fat at the time was of course best known for his Hong Kong films like The Killer and Hard Boiled, both of which were directed by John Woo. And if you're a big fan of Hong Kong cinema like I am, you'll know that it goes a little bit deeper than that. He was also great in A Better Tomorrow 1 and 2, which are John Woo movies that aren't necessarily talked about quite as much, along with Once a Thief, which was more of a light-hearted Chow Yun-Fat movie, which is more what he was actually kind of like in Hong Kong as opposed to how he was cast in the US. Also, he did a lot of great movies with the late director Ringo Lam, including Prison on Fire 1 and 2, and the great Full Contact, which stands as one of the most badass gangster movies of the 90s. And of course, there's also God and Gamblers 1 and Return of God of Gamblers. And in fact, the series is still kind of going on right now with the movies that Chow Yun-Fat's making with Wong Jing, called From Vegas to China, and all those terrible movies, I have to say, all being, in a way, continuations of the God of Gamblers series. But I digress a lot. Chow Yun-Fat, for all of his talent, and the fact that he got a couple of really strong starring vehicles, including this and The Corruptor, and even the prestigious Anna and the King co-starring Jodie Foster, never really was able to catch on with American audiences in the kind of movies that he made in Hong Kong. He soon found himself starring in martial arts movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which coincidentally was probably his biggest hit ever, and Bulletproof Monk, despite distinctly not being a martial artist. It's a shame that Chow Yun-Fat was pigeonholed, because I think back in the 90s they saw a Chinese lead and they just figured, oh, he must be good at Kung Fu. I mean, obviously that's not the case, and he was never allowed to do anything but do Kung Fu, even if it was something that didn't come naturally to him. And it's a real shame that he was pigeonholed, because Chow Yun-Fat was probably one of the most charismatic actors of his era and an icon worldwide, seemingly everywhere except for North America, although he definitely has a huge cult of fans here as well. And I have to say, Chow Yun-Fat, to this day, is definitely not suffering, because he's still one of the most popular actors in China despite being in his 60s, with his movies routinely ranking among the top grossers of the year. Although I have to say, I haven't really been a huge fan of his output as of late since Let the Bullets Fly, just because his movies are catered towards a distinctly Chinese market, and they all kind of embrace this really zany vibe that I don't think translates very well, although the movies are still making a ton of money. And Chow Yun-Fat, I have to say, is a pretty generous guy, with him recently announcing that he was giving all of his money away to charity. What a guy. He lives on less. He's somebody that I think a lot of American actors could look up to as someone who actually tries to make the world around him a better place. But again, I digress. One of the reasons that The Replacement Killers is a good movie is that Antoine Fuqua not only knew about Chow Yun-Fat's history with John Woo and appreciated that, but the fact is he actually really liked Chow Yun-Fat as a person, with him saying in an Ain't It Cool News interview years later that Yun-Fat was one of those guys that I admired watching every day because he was so calm and comfortable and friendly. He was just a good person. And one day I was in my trailer just frustrated and upset about a lot of different things. And I remember saying something to Chow like, how come you're so calm about the process of making movies? And he said something like he was just comfortable being Chow Yun-Fat, just being who he was. It wasn't any put on, and he wasn't trying to be a movie star. He was just really comfortable as a human being, just cool as shit. Everything about him was just cool, and I couldn't figure out why he was that way. He was like, I've been through all that, and I've come to the conclusion in my life that I'm really comfortable being Chow, and I'm not trying to be anyone else. It was one of those things that really stuck with me, for me as a person, not just as a director. You need to get really comfortable with who you are, and just roll with that. I'm not trying to hurt anybody, or be an asshole, or be the screaming mad director that people may want you to be. Just be who you are. And I have to say, it was really good advice and a great lesson for Fuqua to learn, because it's helped him have an amazing career as probably one of the top action directors in the world, and a guy that I've interviewed a bunch of times. And I have to say, always a pleasure to talk to. He's a really knowledgeable film guy, and he's always fun. He doesn't take himself too seriously. I think that's the reason why Antoine Fuqua has stuck around for such a long time, although he's made some pretty amazing movies. Now, for what it was, The Replacement Killers did pretty well at the box office. It only made $20 million domestic, which was below its $30 million budget, but I reckon that after foreign box office, they more than broke even, and it became a solid hit on DVD, with Sony re-releasing it many times, making it a staple of their catalog. They even released it on the short-lived UMD format, which, if anybody knows, was for PSP, PlayStation Portable, which was a thing for a while. For some reason, studios seemed to think that people were just going to watch movies on their devices on little discs. this thing called the iPhone came along and, well, kind of ruined things for PSP. Fuqua, after another flop with the movie Bait, starring Jamie Foxx, which I also think is kind of underrated, finally found its niche with Training Day and has since become, I have to say, one of the most solid directors that's out there. I don't know if I'd call The Replacement Killers a great movie, but it's definitely a fun movie. It's certainly imitative of Chaeyoung Fat's movies with John Woo, with him essentially playing the same guy that he played in The Killer. And the carnage never quite approaches the symphonic levels of something like Hard Boiled, but as far as American Hong Kong movie clones go, it's definitely one of the best. This is mostly thanks to Chow Yun-Fat's absolute charm and Antoine Fuqua's style, which he really did tailor to his star. Again, Fuqua really liked Chow Yun-Fat, and he showcases him in the best light possible. You can really tell that him and the crew appreciate their star because they make him look, as Fuqua said, cool as shit throughout. The movie is full of low-angle hero shots, and I have to say, Chow Yun-Fat looks probably the best that he looked outside of his Hong Kong movies. He's in great shape, and he looks, fresh-faced and ready to take on Hollywood. Although, one of the negatives is that it's undeniable that his English at the time was kind of limited, so they kind of make him the strong, silent type. Which is funny if you watch his Hong Kong movies because he's really not the strong silent type. He's actually very talkative in his films and kind of zany. They couldn't really do that because his English just wasn't there at the time.
I still need papers.
Yeah, great.
But, it really picked up over the years, and if they were to do another movie with him in North America, I think that, Chow Yun-Fat could still nail it. Now, his chemistry with Mira Sorvino suffers a little bit because they can't really have a lot of dialogue scenes together, but what's really funny is that for some reason they decided not to make these two photogenic sexy actors have a romance. And I think one of the reasons is that in the 90s, interracial relationships in movies were still pretty rare. And I remember hearing that Murder at 1600 had love scenes between Wesley Snipes and Diane Lane that were cut out. And I think that really dates the movie in kind of a nasty way. I mean, there's no way that these two beautiful people would be slammed together in this carnage-filled world and, not get it on. What's really funny too is that Mira Sorvino apparently got along great with Chow Yun-Fat because she can actually speak Cantonese. She also gave Fuqua high marks, saying in a Random Roles AV Club interview that I really loved working with Antoine, and it was fun to do an action movie. It was kind of like being a kid playing cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers, and I enjoyed the role of Meg. I thought she was fun to do. I blew out my voice when I was doing a reshoot of Mimic because it was one of those screaming scenes where I'm in the subway and I'm yelling because a monster is coming. And when I came to the set of The Replacement Killers, Antoine was like, "Ooh, I like your voice that way. Keep it." So every day I had to yell to burn out my vocal cords. My voice wasn't the same for a year and a half afterwards because it had a rough, gravelly, 2 registers lower sound to it. So yeah, she does sound kind of different, come to think of it.
You must be kidding. I'm not going anywhere with you. You're like a walking goddamn bullseye.
Yeah, I got a great sense of humor. That's something you're gonna find out about me. I'm funny and I can take a joke. A lot of people can't take a joke.
And I have to say, Sorvino really does seem game in an action movie, and you'd think after watching this, why is it that Mira Sorvino wasn't able to parlay her success in this movie into a bunch of action roles? I mean, I could have easily seen her in the Mila Jovovich mold. Unfortunately, she was blacklisted by that asshole Harvey Weinstein because she wouldn't sleep with him. So, once again, fuck Harvey Weinstein. Now, with Chow Yun-Fat not saying a lot in this movie, Mira Sorvino kind of has to handle most of the exposition, so in some ways her role is almost bigger than his. And another person who arguably benefits from this all is Michael Rooker, in a rare sympathetic part as the targeted cop whose son has been marked for death by the Triad, and he chases after Chow Yun-Fat thinking that Chow Yun-Fat is coming to kill his son, not knowing that Chow Yun-Fat is actually trying to protect his son. And he gets a lot more screen time here than you'd think. Now, the movie also has really cool villains, Danny Trejo and Till Schweiger, as actually the titular characters, the so-called replacement killers, while Hong Kong actor Kenneth Tsang, who turned up in The Killer and a bunch of other movies from the era, is really cool and collected as the Triad boss who wants his own son avenged. Now, the movie probably could have done with a little more levity, and I think that was a bit of a failing of Fuqua's at first because his movies were always really heavy. He only really kind of developed a lighter style as his career went on. Even Bait, which is kind of an action comedy, is surprisingly dark. I think that Fuqua just at that time didn't really like to joke around, although he's really definitely livened things up quite a bit. The only kind of comic relief in this movie comes from a very young Clifton Collins Jr., who has probably the only funny bits as one of the underworld snitches. But it all adds up to Fuqua's undeniable film noirish tone, and I have to say the soundtrack by Harry Gregson Williams, with this being his first solo assignment after working on The Rock with Hans Zimmer and Nick Glennie Smith, is propulsive, and the overall look of the movie is really seedy. And I have to say the quick running time, with it running under 90 minutes, really makes it an easy film to just plop in and rewatch time and time again. And I have to say, the best scene in this movie, and probably the most distinctly 1990s scene in the movie, is Chow Yun-Fat's intro, which I think rivals some of his John Woo films, as he walks into a nightclub to the Crystal Method, which I have to say was an absolute staple of films in the era, even turning up in Lost in Space. And that music is great. And he even does kind of a nifty little bullet ballet, like out of a John Woo movie, eliminating his targets and never even getting a single hair out of place. And the way that he spins around and his red tie rests on his gun arm is really cool. Now, I think this movie should have immediately established him as a stylish, cool Asian action icon in North America, but sadly, audiences at the time seemingly just weren't ready for it. And you know what? We need a Chaeyoung Fat for the 21st century. I mean, you know, how about John Cho? Give him a call. I think he'd be awesome as an action star. Good news, The Replacement Killers, if you haven't seen it, is easily available, with it out on DVD and Blu-ray and many streaming sites, including Sony's Crackle, if you want to see it for free and legal. And it's also in Canada available for free, legally of course, on the CTV Go app. So check it out. It's not a classic, but The Replacement Killers is a cool Chaeyoung Fat movie. One hopes that before he calls it a day, Chaeyoung Fat will get one last big actioner to go out on. And I have to say, there have been rumors for years that him and John Woo are having a feud. And if that's true, if he really cannot work with John Woo again, then you know what? Antoine Fuqua would be a great choice to take on the mantle and send him out in a way that does his legend justice and rescue him from all those shitty Won Jing movies that he's making that are playing off the success of God of Gamblers. So, until next time, for JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumray, and you know what? Now, as we're all self-quarantining, I've got a couple of extra bonus recommendations for you Chaeyoung Fat fans out there. If by chance you've seen this video, you watched the movie and you loved it, and you want to know some other good Chaeyoung Fat movies to check out, or if you happen to have seen this movie, and it's another one of the best movies that you never saw that you actually have seen, and you're all angry with me, here are a couple of movies that you should check out to further your knowledge of Hong Kong action cinema. Now, if you're into John Woo and you're into Chaeyoung Fat, you have to watch all of their collaborations. A Better Tomorrow 1 and 2 are terrific. A Better Tomorrow 3 definitely has its moments, but it was directed by Choi Hark, who doesn't quite know the heroic bloodshed genre like John Woo does. Definitely watch The Killer, which is a masterpiece. It's hard for me to make a decision between Hardboiled and The Killer as to what's the better John Woo movie. I think Hardboiled probably has more action and bigger set pieces, but something about The Killer really just kind of gets me. I love both those movies though, and you can't go wrong. Also, check out Once a Thief, which is a much sillier movie than the other John Woo Chaeyoung Fat collaborations, but is a lot of fun, has some good action, and also has a good performance by Leslie Chung, who is also a great Hong Kong legend who unfortunately died a couple years ago. He's also great in The Bride with White Hair and The Bride with White Hair 2, which are directed by Ronnie Yu, who went on to direct Bride of Chucky. If you want to watch a couple of more good heroic bloodshed movies, you should look up the career of Andy Lau, who's still a huge star in Hong Kong and actually did a couple of really good ones of his own, including a few with Chaeyoung Fat, including Rich and Famous and Tragic Hero, which I have to say are definitely not even close to being as good as John Woo movies, but are still kind of fun in their own low-budget way. Chaeyoung Fat also did a couple of other fun movies, including Peace Hotel, which has a really great premise and could easily be remade as a Western, I think, and one really good shootout towards the end, which I hear was actually ghost-directed by John Woo. Unfortunately, John Woo's movies lately have tapered off since he was really big in North America. Red Cliff 1 and 2 are terrific, and watching that together is excellent. The Crossing I haven't seen. I've heard it's not great. I have to say, though, I was not a fan of his latest bullet ballet movie, Manhunt, which I have to say has some cool action, but would have been way better with somebody like Chaeyoung Fat in the lead. Although, if you want to check it out yourself, it's a Netflix original, so give it a look. Until next time, everybody, for JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumray.
JoBlo, he sure likes to drink a lot.
want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at a true neglected masterpiece, Kathryn Bigelow's Strange Days, starring Ralph Fiennes, Angela Bassett, Tom Sizemore, Juliette Lewis, Vincent D'Onofrio, and loads more character actors who were active in the era. Co-written and produced by James Cameron, this was a hugely ambitious $42 million sci-fi epic that unfortunately derailed Bigelow's career for a solid decade before she came back in a massive way with The Hurt Locker. Flashback to Los Angeles in the 90s, and the city was on fire, much like the whole nation is right now, I'm sorry to say. This was the era of the Rodney King beating and riots, the O.J. Simpson trial and acquittal, and the drive-by shootings of Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur, all of which had a huge impact on Strange Days, despite the fact that Cameron had initially conceived of the premise, that being a crime thriller / love story set in the eve of the millennium back in the 80s. In hindsight, a $42 million thriller without any major stars or even huge action set pieces probably seems like an unlikely big studio movie, but keep this in mind. James Cameron was probably the hottest property in Hollywood at the time. Terminator 2 Judgment Day reinvented the modern action movie, and True Lies had printed money for Studio 20th Century Fox. Bigelow was no slouch either. Point Break, which also had some involvement by James Cameron, was a huge hit for the studio, turning Keanu Reeves into an action hero overnight. And $42 million, while expensive, probably seemed like a pretty safe bet. I mean, even if it didn't break even theatrically, there was always home video. And how bad could it do? I mean, it's a sci-fi action movie. Plus, stars Ralph Fiennes and Angela Bassett were both on the rise. They had just earned Oscar nominations, with Fiennes for Schindler's List and Bassett for What's Love Got to Do with It. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty. Whether it was a lack of star power or the fact that audiences were utterly disinterested in watching a movie with a very pessimistic view of the millennium, which was only 5 years away at the time, audiences stayed away in droves. It was basically dumped by the studio, only grossing $7.9 million total. A disaster. It would take a full 5 years before Bigelow got another movie out there, The Weight of Water, which, I'm sad to say, no one saw, including me. 3 years later came K-19 The Widowmaker, but again, despite Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson in the lead roles, it was another disaster. But things turned out just fine for Bigelow, who's now one of the most in-demand directors on the planet. Now, I was turned on to Strange Days by an old magazine called Sci-Fi Universe, which was how us geeks used to get our movie news before the internet really became widespread. Sure, the internet existed in 1995, but unless you had some serious coin and a lightning-fast 96K modem, magazines were all you had. I vividly remember reading an appreciation of this by one of the authors who called the film a neglected masterpiece, and when it hit VHS, I rented it with a friend, and we thought the movie was just great. For one thing, the premise had us hooked. In it, Fiennes plays a former cop named Lenny Nero, who's gotten his hands on Squib, a virtual reality recorder that plugs into your cerebral cortex and can record experiences that could then be sold to the highest bidder. If you want to know what it's like to rob a liquor store, you can do it. If you're a man who wants to experience sex as a woman, or vice versa, no problem. Lenny will sell anything except snuff tapes, meaning no rapes, no suicides, and no murders. He has a virtual monopoly on the trade and prowls the LA nightlife with his loyal bodyguard Mace, played by Angela Bassett, who is secretly in love with her boss due to his kindness to her young son back when he was a cop. Alas, Lenny is madly in love with Juliette Lewis's character, who's basically playing Courtney Love, in that she's a grunge singer tied up with a well-connected record producer played by the raspy-voiced Michael Wincott.
Tell you what, Lenny, just for you, how the fuck did you get up here? Faith always knows what she wants.
When Lenny gets his hands on a snuff tape involving a friend of his, he manages to uncover a conspiracy involving the LAPD's murder of a black activist / rapper, all the while the millennium is slowly creeping up while LA seems on the verge of burning down. It's hard to watch this movie now in some ways, as it feels quite forward-thinking and cutting edge, and how it's a very critical look at the police, with the only truly heroic characters being an ex-dirty cop played by Ralph Fiennes and his gun-toting bodyguard played by Angela Bassett. Now, Fiennes is terrific in what has to be an atypical part, but the real star of the show in some ways is Angela Bassett, who could have been a real contender as a female action star in the mold of Sigourney Weaver had this movie gone over better. She's clearly the heroic lead, while Fiennes' Nero is almost the damsel in distress, a unique take on the genre, especially for 1995. Visually, the film is a feast, with Matthew Leonetti's lensing distinct from Cameron's usual blue light thing, although his fingerprints do feel like they're on the film in some ways. That said, this is Bigelow's film through and through, with it showing off her growing social consciousness in a big way, which would later pay off in movies like Zero Dark 30 and Detroit, while maintaining the propulsive action aesthetic she showed off in Blue Steel, Point Break, and would later use in The Hurt Locker years later. It makes one wish that she'd do another action-driven movie. Plus, the score by Graham Revell is one of his best, with an excellent mid-90s techno song score by Deep Forest, with tracks by Peter Gabriel, Tricky, Lords of Acid, and more. Nowadays, Strange Days is a bit of a cult classic, but it's frustratingly hard to find. It's on DVD in a crummy non-anamorphic transfer, but that's about it. It's never been released domestically on Blu-ray, probably due to Cameron's interference, along with True Lies and The Abyss, which he's always said he'd restore, but he's totally missed the home video revolution because he's been busy with the Navi and Avatar. It's not even available digitally, although it was streaming for a while. That's too bad. Nevertheless, it's worth tracking down, especially if you have a region-free player. This is one great movie and worth rediscovery. I absolutely love it, and if anything, it's more relevant now than it was 25 years ago. For JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.